Yo, a few weeks ago, just as I was beginning to build this dedicated gaming setup in my office, I got this 27-inch 240Hz monitor in. I was psyched to try this out, as for the past 2 years, I've been gaming on a 160Hz ultrawide. Not gonna lie though, it's not what I expected. So the monitor itself is the RC Evolution Premium. I had never heard of the brand before, and actually, this model along with a cheaper 165Hz version are their first ever gaming monitors. There are very slight differences between the two, but essentially the refresh rate is the main one. This video is going to be focused on the 240Hz version though, and more so the experience of playing at that refresh rate. This is a 27-inch monitor, which I find to be the best display size for the setup I'm trying to build. Having used a 32-inch monitor in the past, it takes up quite a bit of space, and since I really am just going to be gaming here, this smaller screen fits much nicer. The design of this monitor is nothing special. The chin at the bottom is pretty thick with the RCA logo at the middle. The side bezels are 1/4 of an inch thick, which isn't bad if you're running just a single one, but it's a little less appealing if you have two lined up next to each other. Looking at the port selection, we have two upstream USB-A's, USB-B to power them, and then dual HDMI ports, DisplayPort, and USB-C for video output. Connecting my 14-inch M3 Pro MacBook to the monitor over USB-C, it was able to run at 240Hz, and with the 90-watt power output, it'll actually keep the laptop charged while working. Just make sure you have the right cable that is verified to support display output. I haven't used the display with the Mac very much, but if you're looking for a monitor to use for both PC gaming and to work on, this actually isn't a terrible choice. With the built-in KVM switch, you can take advantage of those two upstream USB ports to have a keyboard and mouse used for two different machines. The only downside being you have to go through the OSD to swap over. In the box, you get a single DisplayPort cable, which I recommend swapping out for a longer one as it is a little short, making cable management difficult if your PC isn't right next to it. Luckily, the included stand does have a path to route down the cables so you can tuck them away. Setting it up is very easy. You just need to thread the feet into the stand and tighten the 3 screws. Then you can attach the monitor by aligning the top of the mounting tray with the 2 hooks and lock it in place. Once it's on, you can adjust the height, tilt, and rotation, all while feeling very sturdy. Although it is made of plastic and looks quite cheap. I'm also not a fan of its little red accent at the bottom and the fact that it takes up so much space on my desk. For those reasons, I felt base mounting the display was a must, so I picked up a dual monitor arm from Ergear and attached both of the RCA monitors. It was really pricey at over $100, but each arm feels incredibly high quality, and the gas springs make moving the displays around much easier. Once the monitor was on the VESA mount, I was able to truly appreciate the 27-inch IPS panel. With a 2560 by 1440p resolution, this display is able to provide good clarity with its pixel density of 109 pixels per inch. This makes everything look sharp. You'll never have to worry about blurry text or fragmented images. If you're super up close, you will see more individual pixels than if it were a 4K panel, but at an arm's length away, it's completely fine. As far as brightness, this monitor gets up to 300 nits, which in a dimly lit room is fine, but if you're near a window where lots of sunlight comes through, you'll have a hard time viewing things properly. It doesn't do a great job at reducing glare, so you'll want to take that into account. So the monitor does technically support HDR, but with only 300 nits, it's simply not bright enough to truly take advantage of it. When you do have it enabled, it washes out the colors. It makes it look far worse than just using it in SDR. One perk of the IPS panel is that viewing angles are very good. You can essentially look at it from whatever angle without any color shift. Speaking of, I was surprised that these colors do look pretty good, with a 1000:1 contrast ratio and 95% coverage of the DCI-P3 color gamut. As a multi-use monitor for photo and video editing, I'd say it's actually quite capable. A lot of times, at least in my experience, gaming monitors tend to be pretty shitty when it comes to color accuracy, but straight out of the box with no adjustments, I was pleasantly surprised. One downside of this panel being IPS is that there will be significant backlight bleed if you're on a black screen or just in a darker part of a game. Luckily, it's not terrible, but it is something that you have to deal with going with this kind of monitor. That said, I think the trade-off for improved colors is well worth all of the downsides. Now, to the big feature of this monitor, 240Hz. What's the deal with that? I've been playing on a 160Hz monitor for around 2 years and found that I had hit the point of diminishing returns, as when I went to my 120Hz LG C1 or Gigabyte monitor, I didn't really notice anything. But now, playing 240Hz, it feels really smooth. The difference is still marginal and will never top that first game of Siege going from 60 to 144Hz, but just going back and forth between 240 and 165, quick movements feel a lot less choppy. I think that in competitive games, if you have the extra cash, this refresh rate is really nice. And those are basically the only games you'll take advantage of it with. Even having a 4080 on my PC, most games really sit around 140 or much lower than that if it's a newer title with ray tracing or higher fidelity visuals. For single player games, after around 100 FPS, any increased frame rate isn't worth it, as you're never moving around quick enough to notice a difference. Though even just moving around windows on the desktop, it does feel super smooth. Again, though after 120, it's hard to really tell the difference. When you're dealing with a frame rate this high, it's important you have FreeSync or G-Sync enabled so the image isn't choppy. The monitor does include FreeSync, but one of the big issues I had for the first 2 weeks of testing it was that G-Sync wasn't working properly. I had significant ghosting and screen tearing while in game that made the monitor almost unusable. The monitor shows up in NVIDIA control panel as not being validated for G-Sync. I was really confused about this, and after some researching online, I just enabled VRR within Windows, and after a restart, that completely fixed the issue. With that resolved, to test the actual motion blur you'll get in day-to-day use, I loaded up the UFO test and used it with all 3 of the overdrive settings. I found that low was the best option to use as it consistently had the least amount of trails. Now back to the 1440p resolution. Let's say that you do decide you want 240Hz because you're a competitive gamer. I think that this spec is fantastic if you have the right hardware and will be doing some amount of work on the display. The improvement from 1080p to 1440p in terms of clarity is pretty significant, so if you'll be staring at the screen for hours on end, I do think this resolution is really good. But if you have an older PC that won't hit 240 FPS anyways, and you're fine with sacrificing visual fidelity, go with a lower res and cheaper monitor. As for the OSD, I'm not impressed, but navigating it is fairly simple with the joystick at the back. Also, it serves as a power button. Clicking it once brings up the menu where you can cycle through different display and color settings, as well as configure gaming specific settings like G-Sync and overdrive. Alternatively, you can access the quick access menus by just moving the joystick without pressing it in. There's ones for the input, visual preset, the KVM switch, and gaming settings like a crosshair or an FPS counter. The monitor retails for $429, which for what you get is a little on the pricier end because there's a lot of cheaper options with the same specs. Though I think that this spec, 1440p 240Hz, is the best middle ground for competitive gaming, as you can appreciate that high refresh rate while still getting great visuals. Don't expect going from 144Hz to 240Hz to be life-changing, though it still is a nice quality of life improvement. So I've really enjoyed using this monitor in my gaming setup. For now, I'd say stay away from that model, mainly because of the G-Sync issues, but 240Hz, it's not really worth it, but it does feel a lot nicer, and if you have some money to spend, play a ton of competitive games, it's not a bad buy. If you guys want to see a full breakdown of the new setup behind me, make sure you're subscribed. But until next week, take care.